We're going to shift the focus here a little bit and talk about the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, another very, very important consumer protection statute. The state of Florida, for those of you locally, also has a companion statute. It's the Florida Consumer Protection Act, but we're going to focus mainly here on the federal version, or the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. A couple of things that I always like to talk about here, and we start off with what can debt collectors do and what they can't do. It's a very important question in understanding what they can and can't do. They certainly can call. They can try to collect the debt. What they can't do is they can't harass you. They can't threaten you. They can't use legally false statements. And they can't communicate the situation or the debt collection situation to others. Each of these individual items are violations of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act and may provide grounds for a lawsuit against those creditors. A couple things here, and I'm going to, excuse me for a second, I'm going to read directly from the statute because it's important to have some of these things exactly correct. But one of the important things about a debt collector in that phone call is what can they do and what can they say. But here's what a debt collector must do. They must identify themselves. They must state that they are confirming or correcting location information regarding the consumer, but only if they are expressly requested must they identify who they work for. So this is one of the most important aspects to a Fair Debt Collection Practices case, or setting forth the documentation required to move forward with the Fair Debt Collection Practices case. Oftentimes I have people call and say, I've gotten 15 or I've gotten 20 phone calls from this phone number, help me. And a lot of times, we can look up the phone number and we can see who it correlates to, or we can see that there's been numerous complaints made about this phone number. But if I don't know the company, it becomes very difficult for us to track them down and get any relief for the consumer. As hard as it is, sometimes it's important to answer that phone call. You don't have to talk to them long, but you do need to ask them and get them to identify who they're working on behalf of. There are numerous debt collection agencies out there. It's important to make sure that you take and get that information as correct as possible. There's debt collection, companies that use National Debt Collection Services, National Debt Collection Service. These are two different companies. It's important when you're getting that information to make sure you record it accurately. After you've identified the phone number, you don't need to continue answering the phone. You can just log the phone calls at that point. But it's very, very important to take that first step in identifying exactly who is collecting or who is trying to contact you. The second thing is the reason why it's important is we have to identify what type of debt it is. The Fair Debt Collection Practices Act only covers consumer debt. Consumer debt, the best definition that I've come across, or the best way for me to explain consumer debt to the individual, is consumer debt is a debt that's not incurred for purposes of making a profit. And I think that's ultimately the best definition to go for. There's certainly some gray areas. There's some areas with regards to a house that was my homestead and I didn't really have a profit motive for it, but I moved to a new house and I started renting out my old house. Is that debt consumer debt, or is it non-consumer debt? Those are issues that have to be argued, and they're definitely legal questions. I usually look and characterize it by the type of debt it was at the time it was incurred. If at the time you incurred that debt, it was not being used for a profit purpose or a profit motive, then I'm going to consider that debt to be consumer debt in most cases. The second thing to look at is what constitutes harassment or abuse. Certainly the threat of violence, the threat of criminal proceedings, the threat of bodily harm is abuse. Harassment's a little bit different. Are 2 phone calls a day harassment, or are 5 phone calls a day harassment? There's no specific standard in the statute. It's one of those things that if it feels like harassment, you'll know it. If it's 2 phone calls a day once a week, probably not harassment. But if it's 2 phone calls every day for a month, that is probably harassment.